The Associated Press just dropped a sobering news story which serves as an update to an ongoing discussion that you and I have had about a second terrifying hypothetical Trump administration and his vision for executive power. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. Maybe check out my Patreon. I'd appreciate the support. Okay, so again, we've discussed this in multiple videos over the past year or so. Basically, Donald Trump has a terrifying authoritarian vision for a second administration, a second Trump administration. He basically forecast it, he signaled it in the last year that he was in office during the first Trump administration, during COVID, and in particular, in light of the 2020 election, okay? Notions of potentially declaring martial law, seizing voting machines, appointing a new attorney general who was basically a handpicked toady and going for broke. I mean, these are notions that Donald Trump seriously toyed with as he was trying to pressure the vice president to steal the election from Joe Biden. And Donald Trump's talked about this at rallies. It's discussed at length on his website. He's done videos about this, and there have been exhaustive investigative reporting with many conservative groups supporting Trump in his efforts to reshape the federal government. Now, as a recap, this notion it has its roots in a constitutional theory called Unitary executive theory, and the too long didn't read version is this. This is an obscure legal theory, an obscure constitutional theory that's really popular with certain conservatives and certainly predates Trump. And it basically holds that the Constitution empowers the president to effectively be a dictator, an all-powerful God effectively within the executive branch, that his authority within the executive branch is absolute and not subject to congressional oversight or judicial intervention, that there's no room for independent state agencies or independent agencies or employee protections. Basically, if the president wants to fire anybody, literally anybody at any time for any reason, he can do so. No cause is needed. The FCC, the Federal Reserve, any so-called independent agency, the president can have absolute control over for his 4 years. It's a terrifying notion and seems to run counterintuitive to what the framers intended. Certainly, the president, again, as we've discussed, is individually the most powerful person in the country, the most powerful office in the country by far, wielding more authority in that office than any single senator or governor or congressperson or Supreme Court justice. That makes sense. He's supposed to be the chief executive. But given the scale and scope and the power of the federal government and the executive branch, which is by far the biggest of the branches, by far, when you factor in the military and various agencies, the FBI, law enforcement agencies, the executive branch is massive compared to even the legislative branch, but also the judicial as well. And so the idea that control would basically be just an absolute dictatorship within that branch makes absolutely no sense, right? That would be a violation of checks and balances. That would make the president, who again is individually the most powerful person in the country by far, even more powerful. And then imagine you have a situation where that power is wielded by someone as corrupt and incompetent and malignantly narcissistic as Donald Trump, and you have a nightmare scenario. That's the recap. So let's get into the article. It dropped today and it says, look, conservatives are on a mission to dismantle the U.S. government and replace it with Trump's vision, okay? Kristen Eichhammer Wright talks to fairgoers in the Project 2025 tent at the Iowa State Fair in Des Moines, Iowa, with more than a year to go before the 2024 election. A constellation of conservative organizations is preparing for a possible second White House term for Trump. The Project 2025 effort is being led by the Heritage Foundation think tank. Okay, so we probably won't read the whole thing, but I do want to get the gist of it with you, okay? A constellation of conservative organizations preparing for a second Donald Trump administration, recruiting thousands of Americans to come to Washington on a mission to dismantle the federal government and replace it with a vision closer to his own. Led by the long-established Heritage Foundation and fueled by former Trump administration officials, the far-reaching effort is essentially a government in waiting for the former president's second term, or any candidate who aligns with their ideals and can defeat President Biden in 2024. With a nearly 1,000-page Project 2025 handbook and an army of Americans, the idea is to have civic infrastructure in place on day one to commandeer, reshape, and do away with what Republicans deride as deep state bureaucracy, in part by firing as many as 50,000 federal workers. We're going to get to this. I mean, if that's not scary enough, we're going to get to this second scary thing in just a second. But as a reminder, there's usually like a pretty vast continuity of government. Certainly, a new president has considerable hiring and firing power, especially over key positions. Think of the cabinet, right? The cabinet is the president's most powerful officers, the second tier of most powerful officers within the executive branch outside the president himself. And he has, they have to get congressional approval. The Senate has to approve his nominees, but he can hire and fire whoever he wants. Now, approval has to be done by the Senate, but he can fire any cabinet secretary he wants. And again, this makes sense, right? Certainly the president should have, especially with key important positions, hiring and firing power, right? But so many federal employees are protected by the president where he has to he can only fire them or have them fired with cause. And that's good, right? That creates a continuity of government from administration to administration and prevents major abuses of executive branch authority by a deranged demagogue like Donald Trump. So I think in the end, currently the president either hires and fires or has hiring and firing like direct capacity without cause for like 4,000 positions in the federal government, which is quite a bit. And again, those are key, powerful positions, which in turn have hiring and firing power over many others. They want to expand it to 50,000 federal workers on day one. It's insane. Let's move on. We need to flood the zone with conservatives, said Paul Dans, director of the 2025 Presidential Transition Project and a former Trump administration official who speaks with historical flourish about the undertaking. Flood the zone with conservatives. This is a clarion call to come to Washington. People need to lay down their tools and step aside from their professional life and say, this is my lifetime moment to serve. That sounds culty. That sounds really culty. Sounds deranged. The unprecedented effort is being orchestrated with dozens of right-flank organizations, many new to Washington, and represents a changed approach from conservatives who traditionally have sought to limit the federal government by cutting federal taxes and slashing federal spending. Instead, Trump-era conservatives want to gut the administrative state from within by ousting federal employees they believe are standing in the way of the president's agenda and replacing them with like-minded officials more eager to fulfill a new executive's approach to governing. The goal is to avoid the pitfalls of Trump's first year in office when the Republican president's team was ill-prepared, his cabinet nominees had trouble winning Senate confirmation, and his policies were met with resistance by lawmakers, government workers, and even Trump's own appointees who refused to bend or break protocol or in some cases violate laws to achieve his goals. While many of the Project 2025 proposals are inspired by Trump, they are also being echoed by GOP rivals Ron DeSantis and Vivek Ramaswamy, who are gaining prominence among other Republicans. As a matter of fact, Ron DeSantis, actually, he's gone on the record about this multiple times, that he wants to reject, I think he calls it a canard, that the Department of Justice is supposed to be independent from the sitting president. He's basically like saying, look, it's an executive branch agency, and it's not supposed to be independent or somewhat independent of the president. It can be a tool in the president's disposal, and that's how we need to look at it. That's the way it should be, and that's the way he wants to use it. And certainly the Department of Justice does ultimately answer to the president. I mean, the Attorney General serves the president. The Attorney General is the head of the Department of Justice. But basically what Ron DeSantis wants is a Department of Justice whose prosecutorial decisions are directed at the president, that it's appropriate for the president to go and say, yep, investigate this person, don't investigate this person, prosecute this person with this, prosecute them here, here, and here. That basically the president should have day-to-day control, if he so chooses, over the Department of Justice. Think how dangerous, again, that would be. And if you're conservative, whatever you might think about the Department of Justice now, imagine that you get a pissed-off progressive in there who's like, yeah, forget this due process thing, forget these long investigations, forget weighing it carefully, just prosecute this person, this person, this person, this person, here, here, and here, and here. And we know that's not the case in the current Justice Department, but imagine a scenario in which that hypothetical is turned against you. It would be terrifying. And I say that as a progressive, right? We don't want a Department of Justice that is literally day-to-day at the beck and call of the sitting president. If the Trump wins a second term, the work from the Heritage Coalition ensures that the president will have the personnel to carry forward his unfinished White House business. The president, day one, will be a wrecking ball for the administrative state. And it makes me think of Miley Cyrus. I came in like a wrecking ball. Miley, listen, nobody does wrecking balls better than me, Miley, seriously. Kofefi. Yeah, much of the new president's agenda would be accomplished by reinstating what's called the Schedule F, which we talked about that in a previous video. It would create a new categorization of federal employee that would reclassify tens of thousands of the 2 million federal employees as essentially at-will workers who could more easily be fired. President Biden, it never went into effect. Donald Trump had it drafted and ready to go, but his senior staff said they would not enforce it, and so it just kind of sat in limbo until Biden was elected, and then Biden trashed the order. He's like, no president should have that power, and so he shredded it. But now Trump supporters are wanting to reinstate it. It frightens me, said Mary Guy, a professor of public administration at the University of Colorado, Denver, who warns the idea would bring a return to a political spoils system. Experts argue Schedule F would create chaos within the civil service, which was overhauled during President Carter's administration in an attempt to ensure a professional workforce and end political bias dating from 19th century patronage. Yeah, okay, there you go, right here. As it just stands, just 4,000 members of the federal workforce are considered political appointees who typically change with each administration, which is what I mentioned earlier. But Schedule F would put tens of thousands of career politicians at risk. We have a democracy that is at risk of suicide. Schedule F is just one more bullet in the gun. And again, folks, the article goes on. There's a top-to-bottom overhaul of the Department of Justice, curbing its independence and ending FBI efforts to combat the spread of information. It calls for stepped-up prosecution of anyone providing or distributing abortion pills by mail. Okay? There are proposals to have the Pentagon abolish its recently diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives because, of course, they don't want minorities and marginalized groups serving in the military. God forbid. What the project calls the woke agenda, and reinstate service members discharged for refusing the COVID vaccine. Chapter by chapter, the pages offer a how-to manual for the next president, similar to the one that Heritage produced 50 years ago ahead of the Reagan administration. Again, the Unitary executive theory thing, it goes back. It was really hit prominence in terms of a more conventional audience among conservative scholars during Ronald Reagan's first campaign. A chapter written by Trump's former acting Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security calls for bolstering the number of political appointees and redeploying office personnel with law enforcement ability into the field to maximize law enforcement capacity. The book suggests the new administration should re-examine the tradition of providing workspace for the press corps and ensure the White House counsel is deeply committed to the president's agenda. Turn the White House counsel into the president's personal attorney and remove the press corps, because the press corps, I think they work in the West Wing of the White House. They don't just visit, they don't just travel to the White House during press briefings and then leave. They're on site in case of breaking news. And of course, Donald Trump would want to distance himself from the press, which, by the way, that should freak anybody out of any political persuasion. Even President Biden, as contentious as his relationship sometimes is with the press, he hasn't kicked Peter Doocy and Fox News out of the White House. He hasn't removed their cubicle. And it would be ridiculous if he did. Folks, we can't have this. This should be setting off alarm bell after alarm bell. Let's see. Dorian Greenwald, national president of the National Treasury Employees Union, said most federal workers live in the states and are your neighbors, family, and friends. Federal employees are not the enemy. It just, again, it goes on and on and on. It's terrifying. It really is. And this, again, is an ongoing story, an ongoing discussion that we've had. It's not going to go away. Donald Trump wants to hoard executive power unto himself like Smaug, like a dragon with gold or something like it's genuinely terrifying. It would be this notion, if propagated by anybody, conservative or progressive, Democrat or Republican, it doesn't matter. The idea of a chief executive blatantly wanting to accrue more power unto himself should raise alarm bells in anybody. People were justifiably concerned when executive power increased under President Obama, for example. It increased under President Bush. It scared people. It increased under President Obama. It also scared people. And again, I say that as somebody who was a Democrat who liked President Obama. No matter what your political persuasion is, and no matter what its defense, we should be by default skeptical of any chief executive of any political persuasion seeking to accrue power. And in this case, Trump is doing it so transparently. 1,000-page Bible or grimoire about how to seize more power and strip employee protections and take control of independent agencies like the Federal Reserve. Imagine the Federal Reserve under the day-to-day control of the president. Right now, the Federal Reserve technically reports to the president. The chairman of the Fed, Jerome Powell, can be fired by President Biden, his boss, but only for cause. Biden has to have cause to fire Jerome Powell because the idea is, given that the Federal Reserve dictates monetary policy in the United States, you probably just don't want any political person or politician, political appointee, which is what the president is, who's a politician, just absolutely in control of the nation's monetary policy. There have to be checks and balances. This is so counterintuitive. It's so insane. It's authoritarian. And Donald Trump's going for broke. And add this to the pile of the many, 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 many reasons why this man is unfit for office.